So my name is Gunnarsson. So if anyone was struggling with the pronunciation, then you know how to say that. And my role with Deutsche Post DHL, I have a dual role. On one hand, I have a responsibility for the Americas, where I am responsible for tactical purchasing, the standards and tools and processes that we implement in the organization, controlling performance management, etc., any support function for procurement. But then also have a global role where I am the purchasing process lead or tactical purchasing process lead. And what I will talk to you about today is the journey where we have been on for about a year and a half, and that we're continuing on to optimize our tactical purchasing and how that will be incorporated into our organization, how we're driving that forward. A second piece of this is also directed towards our BPO relationship that we have in one of our regions and how that is working out for us. So first of all, a little bit about Deutsche Post DHL. We are a global company that really is touching 5 different areas. On one of the areas that we're touching is postal service in Germany. This is a huge operation, but it's only about a fifth of our revenue in total. We have our express delivery, which is the brand DHL is well known under. We are the number 1 in international express delivery, and although we have less presence domestically in the US, and I know UPS is here completely dominant in the US domestically, we are, however, the biggest international express delivery provider. Furthermore, we are also the world's largest freight forwarding business, so we do sea freight and air freight. This is a large portion of our business, and then we're also the largest contract logistics provider, so warehousing and distribution. And in the US, we operate here under the brand Excel, but in all other countries, we operate that division and all other divisions under the brand DHL. Deutsche Post, we're only in Germany, where we have the mail service. Furthermore, we're also doing e-commerce and parcel. This is something that previously operated under the brand Global Mail. Here in the US, we have about a $1 billion business for parcel delivery. So if you get something from Amazon, it will potentially be from our Global Mail business as well. And we are a huge company. We have almost 500,000 employees. We are present in 220 countries. And some statistics here, we had last year, our revenue was about 55 billion euros, so about $75 billion. Some statistics on, we have a lot of 23 million square meters of warehouse space, 4.1 million tons of air freight, etc. So truly an enormous company. And we also have our challenges in terms of the different business segments or divisions that are operating separately. And so from a shared service perspective, I will touch upon that challenge a little bit. So global business services. So procurement function is a part of our global business services function. This includes IT and finance, obviously, but also we have a very large real estate group. You saw some statistics on the number of square feet we had. So real estate is a key aspect of our shared services. HR operations, legal services, fleet. We also have an in-house consulting group that is also part of our global business services group. About 11,000 employees out of the 500,000. The objective of this Global Business Services Group is essentially to support all those business units or those divisions with those services in a standardized way. And this is also a part of the challenge that procurement is faced with about the procurement organization, how we're organized. On one hand, we have regional responsibilities. We're present in 45 countries. On the other hand, we also have functional responsibilities. We have a corporate sourcing group. We have a corporate standards and tools group, which I'm a part of, controlling performance management, etc. We have about 500 people in our procurement organization, and we are primarily supporting about 9 billion euros of spend and more than 50 ERP systems that we're dealing with. And the challenge that we've been faced with, were faced with about 2 years ago, was that we were asked to improve the efficiency of our transactions that we manage by 20% by the end of 2013, which we're past now. So at the same time as we were asked to improve the compliance to the procurement process. And what we have realized is, being present in so many countries and having so many functions, we've had a mix of people doing a little bit of about everything in a number of those places. This was posing a challenge for us as we were tasked to improve our efficiency. We couldn't really derive and break out and improve those processes if they weren't separated from each other. And this is where we had a group, including myself, that were tasked to look at tactical purchasing specifically and see how we can be able to achieve that 20% efficiency improvement by taking a number of steps of centralizing procurement or purchasing. What we did was that we decided that we were going to look at this in 4 different steps. And I'll take you through those different steps and what we have been doing there. The first step is separation of duties, essentially being able to break out the activities that we are involved in those countries where we may have just a few people, but we're doing a little bit of everything. Second of all, standardizing what we're doing. And again, the focus was here on tactical purchasing, but there was spin-off effects onto sourcing and other areas as well. Automation, increase automation in our transactions. And then finally consolidate into fewer locations. We basically had purchasing performed out of each of the 45 countries that we were in, and we had to consolidate to be able to save costs. So I will take you through those and what actually we have been doing and what we're doing there. First of all, so in procurement in DPDHL is essentially providing 2 different products, sourcing and purchasing. And this was defined some time ago. But we've been doing that in a mixed manner. So up there on the left side, we have our procurement process wheel, as we call it, which addresses the sourcing process, and which we have a 5-step sourcing process, and then the requisitioning process that we're supposed to be supporting. We have broken out the responsibilities, and specifically those areas that had multiple touch points, to try to define ownership between either a purchasing group or a sourcing group. And we've essentially separated those roles. So when you look at items like supplier selection, the purchasing channel, the supplier performance measurement, and the purchasing compliance activities, those were all defined, and we tried to be as clear as we could in clarifying who owns what type of activity in those different areas. Furthermore, we also had to define thresholds for spend that would be owned by the different functions, purchasing and sourcing. So we defined something that we called A country and B country. A country, it wasn't overly scientific, but basically any country that had a procurement spend of more than 100 million euros, and B country anything less than that. So we ended up with some 10, 15 A countries and the rest B countries. We also looked at supply market complexity and corruption index to come up with which countries should fall under each of those umbrellas. And then we defined the different levels of a process that had to be followed. So we had tactical purchasing, had to be involved in any purchase that was between, in an A country, 1,500 and 150,000 euros. If a purchase or annual spend in an area was above that value, it had to go through the strategic sourcing group to be sourced properly. We also had thresholds for when procurement is not required to be involved, which is always difficult to monitor, but it was important for us to define a lower limit so that we can apply that if necessary from a compliance perspective. And as we did that, we also looked at each of the different activities and split them up between purchasing and sourcing. Something that we learned by doing this was that you cannot create waterproof walls between those functions. They need to interact in every aspect of the source and purchasing process, because there will always be overlaps. There will always be situations where the groups need to work properly together. And this became an even bigger challenge when we outsourced a part of our purchasing process in one of our regions. Then became even more important that the external provider had that relationship and that interaction with our retained sourcing group. In our in-house purchasing centers, this has become equally important, but we're still in the same organization, so it's easier to manage that. So second step was standardization. So standardization, when we now look at the tactical purchasing operation, first of all, we standardize the roles of a buyer. What does a buyer do? What are the types of activities they're involved on a more detailed level? We define standard operating procedures, and the objective has been that 90% of what a buyer does should be the same, regardless if you're in Costa Rica or China or Germany. And we've been holding well to that so far. There have been fewer exceptions. And surprisingly, through this process, we've seen how purchasing process is not very different across the regions. This was also very important when we decided to outsource a part of this, because standard operating procedures then became the standard operating procedures for our outsourced provider. And actually every one of these steps were critical for us to be able to engage in a relationship with our outsourced provider. KPIs, we've aligned 6 performance indicators for the tactical purchasing groups that we are measuring globally. We don't have the same objectives because we're different maturity levels in different regions, but they all are measured in the same way, and we're setting targets based on what the improvement potential is in that specific area. E-purchasing. So although we would love to be consolidating to one purchasing platform, we haven't been able to do that. We are, however, able to consolidate to 2 platforms, which we're happy about. So we're using SAP SRM for 3 of our divisions and Oracle Procurement for the 3rd. This has to do a lot with politics and legacy ERP situation, etc. We're happy that we're able to consolidate to 2. We have the same people operating in both of the systems, and we are currently working on an upgrade of Oracle, and we're putting a lot of effort in ensuring that processes are as similar as possible within the 2 different systems. And by 2015, we will ensure, well, we're still using some old other stuff, but by 2015, we're going to be on those 2 platforms completely, which is for us, based on where we started, has been a big improvement and also a prerequisite to be able to achieve those efficiency improvements. Catalog platform, this is essential for us, and in the next slide I'll be talking about automation. Catalog platform has been important. We have been also over the past few years working on consolidating all our catalogs to one platform, which is IBX Capgemini, which we're now using in 41 countries. That has also been essential for our progress in this area. Automation. Now, tactical purchasing in Deutsche Post DHL is the indirect spend, and it spans over a number of different categories, anything from IT to fuel and professional services, fleet-related items, etc. Supplies, packaging material. So it's all of the, we have a lot of different commodities that are being supported. The objective has been that as many of those commodities as possible should be on standard agreements, and therefore they should be able to be put on catalogs so that there's a self-service operation from the users in the field in the different sites, etc., without essentially any buyer touching it, any physical person touching it and performing any steps on it, on that purchase. We have different objectives by region. I'll show that to you. But the vast majority of our transactions should be able to be going through a fully automated process where the person essentially picks it from a catalog and it interacts directly with the vendor without procurement's involvement. Part of this improvement area has been defining processes for the purchasing group on how to improve the catalog coverage in different countries, especially in emerging markets countries. It's been a challenge to put this mindset in place, and suppliers may not be ready to provide that level of detail of those types of catalogs for us through our marketplace. Sometimes we've been forced to essentially take in the data and create those catalogs ourselves. But what was important for us is that we had a process embedded into the tactical purchasing organization to ensure that we were continuously driving the catalog improvement. And by the way, catalog automation is one of the key performance indicators that the buying groups are measured on monthly. In order to do that, we defined different steps that had to be a part of the purchasing organization's daily tasks. First of all, having a support structure and a content team that are experts in how to, how can we define content? How do we need to sort content? What type of information do you need to put things in a catalog? So that those are in place for each of the regions. Training users is critical because in many cases we've been putting a lot of content on there, but people don't realize that how they should be interacting or using that catalog format. And I have to say, regardless of how good those catalog systems are, we're never going to get to Amazon.com. So there is a certain level of training that's needed for the people in the field to be able to interact and to requisition. We have category leads, and here's an example of how sourcing and purchasing need to work together. We have category leads, category managers in sourcing that need to work with the operational purchasing team to identify the spend that should be moving from non-catalog to catalog. And we have actually, we call it the red, amber, and green process. Red is a fully free text. Amber is a catalog item that requires certain information from the user that they need to fill in. And green is a fully catalog where you just click and order, essentially. Category managers also have e-procurement related KPIs so that they are also expected to continue to improve that catalog automation. We have scorecards that essentially look at commodities and say, what's our catalog penetration here? Who are the top vendors that we're using that are not on catalog? What are the top commodities we're using, so we can help that. We use that information to ensure that we identify more areas to put into standardized agreements and catalogs. Finally, also getting feedback from the organization directly, and we have an annual survey process that we use with our internal stakeholders to gather feedback on how can we improve, and this is also an aspect where we use for catalog improvement, to use that information to improve catalogs further. Another aspect of automation is, so we talked about the procurement content, and we have essentially this connected directly to both our SAP and Oracle platforms. We're interacting with vendors directly through the same marketplace to issue POs, and then in certain areas like the US, we also use that for receiving electronic invoices. And this helps also the payables operation to ensure that we don't have discrepancies in POs and invoices. We eliminate paper, and we have a pre-matching process that avoids invoices getting blocked. It happens through the marketplace, where they essentially have tolerances and etc. that are built in, and they push back directly to the vendor with information of why the invoice wasn't matching a PO. This is very helpful in our payables area to eliminate additional workload and to eliminate paper also. We're trying to push the invoice automation to a larger degree, and here's where I would say we have a challenge with procurement and payables being in separate organizations, where we're not always seeing across the entire P2P process here. So I would say because of how we're operating separately, we haven't had as much success in driving invoice automation through a tool that we already use in procurement, which could be easily used to expand the e-invoicing piece. Last step was consolidation. So obviously, if we're going to be saving money, we need to eventually start cutting heads. And those previous steps that we've taken has enabled us to be more efficient. Eventually, we realized that we need to put these tasks into fewer centers so that we can really optimize the workload across a number of countries, etc. So we've embarked on a consolidation into 8 global purchasing shared service centers, and we've taken a little different approach in the different regions, and I'll take you through this briefly. First of all, then in Asia Pacific, we decided to outsource the tactical purchasing operation, and obviously people may question, why did you choose Asia Pacific? It's not the highest cost in terms of labor area. However, our situation in Asia Pacific was that we did not have a specific country or center where we had a critical mass of procurement people already established. We have the 11 countries that you had various smaller and medium-sized countries, and we realized if we were going to consolidate the support for those countries into one place, we would have to start from scratch almost. We did not have a one place where it would make sense to put that shared service operation. So we ended up going to the market, and there were some attractive alternatives out there, and we ended up going with Capgemini. We've been live with them since August of last year, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about the experience from that relationship so far in the coming slides. In the Americas, at this point, we are in 4 locations. In Costa Rica, Mexico, Brazil, and in Florida. And we are looking at how we can potentially consolidate that further. I can see us being in 2 locations in a short amount of time. This has been a trade-off. It's always a trade-off between how do you believe that you provide the best customer service to our internal customers, essentially, and at the same time become more efficient and cut costs. Our group that sits in Florida has very high level of efficiency, so we haven't touched that yet. They have over the years developed a very high level of automation, and they're very efficient, and they have very good customer service approach. We receive that feedback in service regularly, so we've been deciding to hold that off, and it's a small group also, so the potential labor savings won't be that dramatic, so we're holding off on that. Brazil is another country where we have a challenging environment from a tax and regulations perspective. Brazil is it's not a very low-cost country. It's almost double the cost as we see in Costa Rica and Mexico. But we have not felt that we've been ready to move that yet. And then Costa Rica and Mexico are essentially supporting the rest of the 10 countries or so that are Spanish-speaking in Latin America. So we've been able to consolidate and drive costs down further in this area. So we'll just have to decide next what we do if we want to drive that further and what the savings are for that. In Europe, we have developed a new center in Ostrava, in Eastern Czech Republic. This area was kind of picked by coincidence because we already had a finance shared service center in that area. It's a small city, but it has a large labor pool of competent people that we can find at very low cost compared to, for instance, Prague, which is about double the cost to Ostrava. And so that's why we selected Ostrava. So Ostrava is actually supporting 9 different countries and 9 different languages even, which we've been very impressed by the capability of managing so many languages in that place. We have Koblenz in Germany, which is a legacy shared service location for Germany, and they also have very high level of efficiency. It's also not an area that we're going to be touching as our next steps. We'll hold off on that because it's high level of efficiency and difficult labor market to move away from. Brussels is a center that may be touched next, and if we're successful in Ostrava, we may be moving those operations to Ostrava. So we're still working on this, but we're down to 8 from 42 locations, and it has been a pretty dramatic journey so far. We need to see continuous improvements into this area, and the pressure is there to continue to improve our transaction efficiency. However, we're taking steps carefully, one by one. And we're not going to make any drastic movements because also tactical purchasing is not a purely data entry type of activity. It requires very high level of customer service, working with internal stakeholders. It also requires obviously a lot of interaction with vendors, where we go out and do spot buys and quick sourcing events, etc. And that requires a certain skill level to do that. So we're taking these steps quite slowly so far. Here are some results that we've achieved so far. So first of all, we were able to achieve that 20% reduction in transaction efficiency. We actually achieved by the end of last year, we hit 22%. You see that the biggest improvement has been in Asia. And it's not only because we decided to outsource there, it is also partially because the increase in compliance has been driving more transactions. So we've been lucky to see that it's not only we need to cut costs by 20%, we are seeing increased compliance that will help us on the way as we go through these shared services. And obviously this is also the expected increase in compliance was a reason for why we realized we have to move to these shared service locations, because the way we were organized before, we wouldn't have the capacity to add on or move with the changes in transaction. In Europe, we've been able to improve by 12%, and then in Americas by 23%. You also see that we have a catalog automation rate, which is very high in Europe, primarily driven by Germany, where we've had many years of e-procurement in place and a long tradition of driving catalog automation. So that's obviously impacting our global numbers there. Asia is an area where we are least mature and least newest in terms of using e-procurement, but we are seeing this improving every month, and this is also one of the objectives of our BPO provider to drive catalog automation. Americas is also heavily impacted by the US, where we have over 90% catalog. So these factors do all contribute to how we were able to achieve this transactional cost improvement. Some statistics below also. So our total cost of purchasing was reduced by 14%, but a 19% FTE reduction. So we have seen our share of cuts, but obviously a part of it was also that we had an increase in transactions. We were able to get to the 22%. And our total volume was also increased by 14%. So now, in terms of our BPO relationship in Asia Pacific, I wanted to touch base a little bit on how that's working for us. We essentially selected Capgemini. We had a tendering process last year where we had essentially the biggest competitors out there. And the reason we selected Capgemini was that they were able to present us that they understood our needs and they understood our objectives with this. And what we've seen also during the 6 months of operation is that they've been well executing towards that. It's always turbulent, of course. We had a very short-term transition period, but it's still been over expectations in terms of how they've been performing. We had certain things that we set out in the beginning in this relationship that we've been holding, both of the parties have been holding to. One thing that we made clear internally was that procurement, our internal procurement, we are the face to our internal stakeholders. So if there are issues, they approach us. It's not them, it's not the outsourced provider that's doing that. We are responsible, and we are the interface primarily. However, we also made it clear that we work as a team. So Capgemini and the retained procurement organization should have one face to the customer together, to our internal customer. And that's been working well. It's also been a very open communication so far. There have been a number of issues, which there always is, I believe, but we've been able to communicate and resolve those between the two parties in a way that it's not defensive from one, no, that's not my responsibility. It's been a collaborative environment. That's another success factor. I would say also the ability of this provider to be flexible with the changes that happens after go live. You try to set SLAs up in the beginning. You try to cover every little aspect. When you go live, you're going to see that there's a ton of things that weren't considered or didn't work exactly as we planned. It's the ability of the provider not to just reference to a bullet point in the SLA, rather saying, okay, how can we make this work? How can we adjust the way we support you to make this work under these new conditions? That has been important for us as well. We have on the left side, we have a little bit of our governance model where we have quarterly steering meetings, monthly operational meetings, and then on a daily basis we have the Capgemini team interacting with our retained sourcing people in the countries. And then we have also a relationship manager that essentially acting as when necessary, stepping in between those two parties to ensure that we are aligning and that we're moving towards the same direction. This was one of the internal communications we had when we went live to explain to our internal business on how this is going to work. Essentially, we're saying, and here's again where we're referencing our thresholds. You can probably apply that slide when I talked about how we separate sourcing and purchasing and apply that to this as well, to this model. On the top level, we talk about the sourcing, and we call it the Sourcing Center of Excellence for Asia Pacific, where we instruct the business partners how do they interact with our retained people for different types of issues, and when do they interact with our BPO provider for the tactical purchasing. So this was communicated at the time. We have the two systems, we call them. GET is the SAP SRM, Global E-Procurement Tool, and iProcurement. So those are the two tools we're using there. We have the SLA levels that we also communicated to the business partners that you should expect your purchase order to be processed within 3 to 5 days, and they should be receiving certain spot buy savings on average. Then you have a help desk that also Capgemini provides for essentially the requisitioners and the users up in the business, where they have a response time that they need to adhere to. Those are, by the way, the same KPIs we use for our internal shared service centers so that we can compare the two. Something that was, I think, the biggest challenge when we considered outsourcing this, and actually when we were consolidating those purchasing services even in our internal centers, was how do you actually go about when you need to buy something in a country that you've never visited. You know, you're a buyer, you never visited that country, you may speak the language, but you don't know much about the supplier market in that country. And we shouldn't kid ourselves. The Capgemini people are junior, as well as the buyers that we hire in our own centers. They're junior, and you cannot expect them to be supply market experts. So how do we go about that? So we created this model to talk about what are the steps we go through when you get a spot buy request into a center that needs to be processed and somehow fulfilled. First of all, we have our historical vendor database. So anyone we've used in the past, we created. We call them AVLs, approved vendor lists, which essentially is information we build about vendors we've used in the past. What did we use them for? What did they deliver for us? And that's what we start when we start looking at something that we don't have a contract for. And we start looking at that database. We also look at historic PO data. Maybe we purchased something similar, a year ago, etc. And we can look through that. Finally, in this case, Capgemini offered that they have other clients that they support in the same countries. So they have their own vendor database where they have historical purchases and preferred vendors that have been used for certain things. Finally, you end up with Google. If none of these work, you're going to end up with Google. And there have been a lot of challenges because you may go through every one of those, and none of them get you what you want. When we also have requirements that you need at a minimum 3 bids for a spot buy. So you need to find 3 vendors that can perform this service. There have been challenges in certain countries. India is one of them. Philippines is another, where we have poor vendor databases from the beginning. And there's not a good selection, and you can't find things on the internet. So we have had those challenges, and we try to resolve them as we go. But the benefit of this model is that it's a learning model. So once you've done it, you add one more thing to your list of your vendor database, and the database is going to get richer and richer. So it is working better and better, and this is a model that we're using for all our centers, because it doesn't matter if you're outsourced or insourced. We have our buyers in Costa Rica supporting Peru, has never visited the country, and you need to start build your database so that the person can support the country without starting from scratch, essentially. Some statistics we have with our BPO relationship. So from a KPI perspective, it's been tremendously successful. They've hit, so they're green, like we talked about before. Everyone's green. But the other side to this is actually that we've also have very positive feedback from our stakeholders and from procurement internally with this relationship. So I think when you look at those two together, we see that the relationship has been a success so far, and we will be using this experience to look also on how we can improve our other centers. The next step is obviously to evaluate what do we want to do in the future. Do we want to use a BPO model globally? Certain cases we may not be able to because of labor regulations, etc. But in other areas it may make sense, and we need to establish business case for whether that makes sense or not. That is something that we will be doing in the next year to determine if this model will be expanded or if we will stay within our internal offshore centers in the other regions. We have seen increased catalog penetration, and we've seen decreased FTE levels that they've had in the operation, so decreased cost and an improved cost per purchase order, essentially. Some of the KPIs are here, so we have user queries, catalog automation, PO processing time, etc. Those are all within as expected within the SLAs that we have defined. Finally, some lessons learned for ourselves on the BPO experience we've had there. First of all, in the selection process, we started with essentially all the big providers, and I think everyone have different experiences. You want to end up with a short list of providers that you believe can do this, that have done this before, that have the experience. So we had all the big BPOs there. In the end, we went with this company because we felt that they understood us. They were able to articulate that they understood us better, and I think maybe it also had to do that they really wanted this to work, and they wanted to impress us. The other ones were maybe, and this is always a challenge for us when the scope was fairly limited, which means that the biggest providers may have thought that this is not big enough to put all these resources on. So they may have been following more of a run-of-the-mill kind of approach to that, versus this company who said, we really want this because we think that there's a future here to expand, etc. Another key aspect was we had the CFOs from the business units involved throughout the selection process, so that they were a part of the decision on who was going to do this. We wanted to avoid that people felt that they were excluded and therefore used that as an argument to complain over the decision and where we ended up. Setting KPIs early, we had to make those clear in the RFP process, because it might impact price if they wouldn't have understood what kind of KPIs we expected them to drive. And I think the homework we had done in defining those different steps of standardization, etc., up front helped us to be very clear here in the selection process. As I mentioned, the governance structure, it's not we're implementing, now we're in this together. We need to create a we feeling that we're in this, we need to resolve those issues together. Then finally, continuous improvements. We have very clear clauses in the SLA of how the BPO provider needs to improve their performance over time, and they tie into our own 6 global KPIs for tactical purchasing efficiency.